November 8th, 1519. The Great Causeway of Tenochtitlan. The air is thin and sharp, carrying the scent of lake water, wood smoke, and a million flowers from the floating gardens. A low hum of anticipation rises from the crowds lining the causeway, a sound like a vast beehive. At one end stands a man who is the center of this universe, Montezuma II, the Huey Tlatoani, the revered speaker of the Mexica. He is a living god, draped in cotton as fine as silk, his sandals soled with gold, his cloak a shimmering tapestry of hummingbird feathers that seems to drink the sunlight. His gaze is lowered, as is custom. No mortal may look him in the eye. Before him, the causeway stretches, a marvel of engineering, a stone artery connecting his island metropolis to the mainland. At the other end, a sight of profound and terrifying alienness approaches. It is a clanking, shuffling, metallic beast. 400 men, their faces pale and bearded, encased in steel that glints cruelly under the high Mexican sun. With them are monstrous four-legged creatures, horses, which the people call great deer, and snarling war dogs that strain at their leashes. This is the moment of impact, the collision of two human histories that had, until now, run in separate, isolated streams. The sensory assault is overwhelming. The rhythmic tramp of booted feet on stone, the jingle of harness, the acrid smell of unwashed bodies and sweat-soaked leather, a stark contrast to the perfumed air of the Aztec court. And in the middle of it all, the two leaders meet. Hernán Cortés, his eyes hungry and calculating, dismounts. Montezuma, his face an impassive mask honed by decades of ritual and divine authority, makes a gesture of welcome. It is a moment of supreme, almost unbearable tension, a silent negotiation between a man who believes he is greeting the emissary of a returning god and another who knows he is facing the ruler of an empire ripe for the taking. This single, frozen tableau is the seed of an entire continent's destruction. This is the saga of Montezuma the Younger, the man called Montezuma II, the last fully independent ruler of the Aztec Empire. This is the narrative of him who was considered a god on earth, whose very name could not be spoken by commoners, who commanded armies numbered in the hundreds of thousands and ruled over millions of souls from a city more spectacular than any in Europe. And yet, this is also the story of how this demigod, this emperor of a civilization built on warfare and sacrifice, would ultimately surrender his person, his city, and his entire world to a mere handful of bearded strangers who appeared from the Eastern Sea. To understand this man, we must grapple with the central, maddening paradox of his reign. Why? Why did the leader of one of the most powerful and fearsome empires on the planet seemingly abdicate his authority, welcome his future conquerors into his palace, and allow himself to become their puppet? Was it cowardice? Was it a brilliant, failed strategy of appeasement? Or was it something deeper, a catastrophic failure of a worldview, a spiritual paralysis that gripped him when faced with an enemy who did not conform to any known prophecy or precedent? The question echoes through 5 centuries of history, a haunting inquiry into the nature of power, faith, and civilizational collapse. We must journey back into the very heart of the Aztec cosmos, a world shimmering with brutal beauty and governed by a terrifying, blood-soaked theology, to even begin to comprehend the mind of the man who stood at its apex, the philosopher king who would preside over its spectacular and tragic demise. His story is not merely one of conquest, but of a reality shattered, of a god who found himself suddenly, inexplicably mortal. To understand Montezuma, we must first understand the world he believed to be the entire world, the Tsem Anahuac, the one world surrounded by celestial waters. In the early 16th century, this Mesoamerican universe was at the absolute zenith of its power, a vibrant and violent tapestry of city-states, all dominated by the triple alliance of Tenochtitlan, Texcoco, and Tlacopan, an alliance which in reality was a vehicle for the absolute supremacy of the Mexica of Tenochtitlan. This was an empire built on two pillars: perpetual warfare and the extraction of tribute. Its influence stretched from the arid plains of the north to the sweltering jungles of the south, a mosaic of subjugated peoples who paid their dues in everything from jaguar pelts and cacao beans to jade, turquoise, and most importantly, human lives for sacrifice. Tenochtitlan itself was the heart of this world, an architectural wonder that left the Spaniards gasping in disbelief. A metropolis of over 200,000 people built on an island in the middle of Lake Texcoco, connected by great causeways, crisscrossed by canals, and dominated by the terrifying silhouette of the Templo Mayor, the great twin pyramids dedicated to the gods of war and rain. It was a city of floating gardens, immaculate streets, sprawling markets, and palaces of breathtaking opulence. This was a civilization with sophisticated mathematics, a precise calendar, and a profound understanding of astronomy. Yet, it was a world utterly isolated. While the Aztec Empire consolidated its power, another world, half a planet away, was undergoing a violent and explosive transformation. Europe, a continent forged in the crucible of the Reconquista and the Crusades, was a world of steel, of gunpowder, of ocean-going caravels, and of a militant, expansionist Christianity that saw the entire globe as a battleground for souls and a treasury for gold. While Montezuma was contemplating the movements of the stars from his palace, Ferdinand and Isabella of Spain had unified their kingdom, expelled the last of the Moors, and, in a fit of ambitious gambling, funded a Genoese sailor's quest to find a westward passage to the Indies. The year Montezuma was crowned, 1502, was just 10 years after Columbus made his first landfall in the Caribbean. A historical fuse had been lit, and the two isolated halves of humanity were now on an inexorable collision course. The Spaniards who would eventually arrive on the shores of Mexico were not mere explorers. They were the hardened products of 700 years of warfare, men for whom conquest, plunder, and religious conversion were the very meaning of existence. Montezuma, for all his power, was the ruler of a magnificent, but ultimately fragile, glass house, utterly unaware that a hurricane of steel and disease was gathering force just beyond his horizon. The man who would face this hurricane was a product of the very system he was born to lead, a prince of the Coatepantli, the Serpent House, the royal dynasty of the Mexica. Born around the year 1466, he was the son of the Emperor Axayacatl, a ruler known for his military campaigns and for commissioning the famous Aztec sunstone. Yet, Montezuma the Younger, or Xocoyotzin, was not groomed in the typical mold of an Aztec warrior prince. His predecessors, men like his ferocious uncle Ahuitzotl, were defined by their martial prowess, their aggression, and their relentless expansion of the empire. They were men who led from the front, their bodies scarred, their reputations built on the pyramids of skulls of their enemies. Montezuma was different. From a young age, he was steered towards the priesthood, immersing himself in the complex, esoteric world of Aztec theology, astronomy, and calendrical divination. He was a scholar, a philosopher, a man more comfortable in the serene, incense-filled chambers of the Kalmakak, the elite school for nobles and priests, than on the blood-soaked battlefield. This priestly training would become the defining feature of his character, and ultimately the architect of his downfall. It instilled in him a profound sense of fatalism, a deep and abiding belief in the cyclical nature of time and the inescapable power of prophecy. He saw the universe not as a stage for human ambition, but as a divinely scripted drama in which every event was foretold and every action preordained. His mind wasn't that of a general seeking tactical advantage, but that of a high priest trying to interpret the will of the gods from the flight of a bird or the alignment of the stars. When his uncle Ahuitzotl died, the Electoral Council of Nobles bypassed more experienced military commanders and chose Montezuma to be the next Huey Tlatoani. They likely saw in him a man who could bring order, piety, and a new level of divine authority to the throne. They chose a man of intellect and deep religious conviction, believing he would solidify the spiritual foundations of the empire. They could not have known that they had just placed a man of unshakable faith in charge of a state that was about to be confronted by a phenomenon that his faith could not possibly explain. The coronation of Montezuma in the year 1502 was not merely a political succession. It was a profound re-engineering of the Aztec state and the very concept of its ruler. He ascended the throne as a philosopher king, but his first actions were those of a ruthless autocrat determined to remake the empire in his own image. He immediately initiated a brutal purge of the imperial court. His predecessors had often governed through a more collaborative system, allowing nobles and officials who had risen through merit, even from commoner backgrounds, to hold significant power. Montezuma saw this as a source of corruption and disorder. He dismissed, and in many cases executed, the vast majority of the officials who had served under his uncle, Ahuitzotl. He replaced them with a new class of administrators drawn exclusively from the high nobility, men whose loyalty was to him and him alone. This was a move to create a more centralized, aristocratic state, but it also sowed seeds of resentment among the established power structures. He then turned his attention to the nature of his own office. He dramatically increased the pomp and ceremony surrounding the role of the Huey Tlatoani, transforming it from a position of a first-among-equals warrior king to that of a secluded, unapproachable demigod. He decreed that no one, not even the highest nobles, could look him directly in the eye. They had to enter his presence barefoot, their gaze fixed on the floor. He rarely appeared in public, and when he did, he was carried in a magnificent litter, shielded from the profane gaze of the masses. He was creating an imperial cult, positioning himself as the sole intermediary between the human world and the divine pantheon. This consolidation of power was reinforced by a series of successful, if conventional, military campaigns against rebellious city-states in Oaxaca and other regions, which served the dual purpose of securing tribute and providing the thousands of captives needed for his lavish coronation sacrifices. He was, by all traditional Aztec metrics, a strong and effective ruler. He was centralizing authority, reinforcing the state's religious mandate, and ensuring the flow of goods and sacrificial victims that kept the cosmos in balance. Yet, in doing so, he was also isolating himself, cocooning himself within a rigid etiquette and a chorus of sycophantic nobles, cutting himself off from the gritty realities of his empire. He was becoming a priest-emperor, lost in celestial contemplation, at the precise moment when his empire would need a pragmatic, adaptable warrior. Beneath the veneer of divine authority and imperial power, Montezuma's inner world was governed by a profound and paralyzing fear. This was not the common fear of an enemy army or a political rival. It was a deep, existential dread rooted in the very core of his civilization's cosmology. The Mexica believed they were living in the age of the fifth sun, a world created by the gods after the destruction of 4 previous creations. They saw themselves as the people of the sun, tasked with a sacred and terrible duty, to keep the sun god, Huitzilopochtli, alive and strong enough to battle the forces of darkness each night. The price of the sun's rising every morning was a constant supply of precious water, human blood. This belief system created a state of perpetual anxiety, a sense that the universe was incredibly fragile and could collapse back into chaos at any moment if the rituals were not perfectly maintained. But there was a more specific prophecy that haunted Montezuma's reign. It was the ancient legend of Quetzalcoatl, the feathered serpent, a benevolent god-king who, according to myth, had ruled in a golden age before being tricked by a rival deity and forced to flee into exile, sailing eastward across the Great Sea. Crucially, Quetzalcoatl vowed that he would one day return from the east in a one-reed year of the Aztec calendar to reclaim his kingdom. By a staggering coincidence of history, the year 1519, the year Hernán Cortés landed on the Mexican coast, was a one-reed year. For Montezuma, a man whose entire intellectual framework was built on priestly divination and the interpretation of omens, this was not a coincidence. It was destiny unfolding. His spies and emissaries brought back reports that confirmed his deepest fears. The strangers came from the east. They were light-skinned and bearded like Quetzalcoatl. They possessed powerful thunder sticks, firearms, and they rode upon beasts that made them seem like centaurs. Every piece of information, filtered through the lens of his apocalyptic faith, pointed not to an invasion of foreign men, but to a divine event, the prophesied end of an age. This inner demon, this terror of the fifth sun's end, would dictate his every move. It explains his hesitation, his seemingly inexplicable gestures of welcome, and his attempts to appease the newcomers with gold. He was not dealing with a political or military problem. He was facing the end of his world, an event foretold by his gods, and he was utterly, tragically paralyzed by the weight of that cosmic certainty. The greatest threat to the Aztec Empire was not the 400 Spaniards who landed on its shores, but the millions of indigenous people who were already groaning under the yoke of its rule. Montezuma's true, fateful encounter was not with Cortés, but with the legacy of his ancestors' conquests. The Aztec Empire was not a unified, homogeneous state like those in Europe. It was a fragile, patchwork quilt of conquered city-states and ethnic groups, each forced to pay exorbitant tribute to the insatiable heart of Tenochtitlan. For decades, the Mexica had waged war, not just for territory, but to feed their gods and their economy. This created a vast reservoir of simmering hatred and a desire for revenge among the subjugated peoples. The Totonacs of the coast, the first to encounter Cortés, were a recent addition to the empire and chafed under the demands of Aztec tribute collectors. Further inland lay the formidable Republic of Tlaxcala, a fierce and independent nation that had been locked in a state of perpetual, low-intensity warfare with the Aztecs for nearly a century. The Tlaxcalans were surrounded, blockaded, but never conquered. They were a thorn in the side of the empire, a constant reminder that its power was not absolute. When Hernán Cortés arrived, he did not find a unified kingdom. He found a landscape of deep political fractures, a powder keg of ethnic resentment waiting for a spark. Cortés, a master of opportunistic politics and psychological warfare, immediately understood this dynamic. He was not merely a conqueror, he was a liberator in the eyes of the Aztecs' enemies. After a series of fierce battles that proved the Spaniards' military prowess, the Tlaxcalans made a strategic calculation. They saw in these strange, powerful newcomers not an ultimate master, but a divine tool to be used against their hated enemy, the Mexica. They formed an alliance with Cortés, providing him with tens of thousands of elite warriors, guides, porters, and a secure base of operations. This alliance was the single most important factor in the conquest of Mexico. Without the Tlaxcalans, Cortés' small band of adventurers would have been just another failed expedition, their bones bleaching on some unknown beach. Instead, the Spanish force became the catalyst, the hard nucleus around which the immense anti-Aztec rebellion could coalesce. Montezuma was not facing 400 men. He was facing a full-scale civil war, a massive indigenous uprising that was now armed with Spanish steel, tactics, and an apocalyptic sense of purpose. The reign of Montezuma was built upon a foundation of ritualized violence and economic exploitation, a system perfected over generations, but which he refined to a terrifying degree of efficiency. The primary engine of both state policy and religious practice was the so-called Flower War, Xochiaoyotl. These were not wars of conquest in the European sense, aimed at seizing and holding territory. They were ceremonial battles, prearranged with enemy states like Tlaxcala for the sole purpose of capturing warriors alive. These captives were the highest form of tribute, the fuel for the sacrificial fires of Tenochtitlan. For the Aztecs, this was a sacred duty, a necessary act to maintain cosmic balance. For their enemies, it was a constant, draining terror, a ritual of humiliation and death that engendered a hatred that ran deeper than any political grievance. This system was inextricably linked to the empire's economy. The vast bureaucracy that Montezuma had built was dedicated to managing the flow of tribute from hundreds of vassal city-states. Tribute lists, recorded in intricate codices, detailed the precise quantities of goods demanded. Thousands of magnificent feather cloaks, tons of maize and beans, jars of honey, sacks of cacao, blocks of unrefined rubber, and precious materials like jade, turquoise, and gold. This relentless extraction of wealth funded the lavish lifestyle of the Aztec nobility and the immense cost of public works in Tenochtitlan, but it created an empire that was, in essence, a parasite. It produced little of its own, subsisting instead on the labor and resources of others. This made the empire powerful, but also monstrously brittle. Its power projection depended on the constant threat of military force. The moment that threat was challenged, the entire economic and political structure was at risk of collapse. The arrival of the Spaniards was precisely such a challenge. When Cortés began to defy Montezuma's envoys, refusing their gifts and their demands that he leave, he sent a shockwave through the empire's vassal states. For the first time, a power had emerged that did not seem to fear the might of Tenochtitlan. This emboldened subject, peoples like the Totonacs to rebel, to refuse tribute, and to cast their lot with the newcomers. Montezuma's empire, which seemed like an indestructible obsidian monolith, was in reality a house of cards built on fear, and Cortés had just revealed that its foundation was starting to crumble. The first reports that reached Montezuma were fragmented, otherworldly, and deeply unsettling. Fishermen and coastal villagers spoke of floating mountains, or towers, that had appeared on the eastern horizon, moving upon the water. These were, of course, the Spanish caravels, but in the Aztec imagination, which had no concept of such large sailing vessels, they could only be divine or supernatural phenomena. Then came the messengers, swift runners, who carried painted cloths depicting what they had seen. The images were terrifying in their alienness. They showed pale-skinned men with beards the color of the sun, their bodies encased in shining metal. They depicted enormous, hornless deer that these men rode upon, beasts of incredible speed and power. Most frightening of all were the thunder sticks, the harquebuses and cannons. The painted reports showed them belching smoke and fire, capable of shattering trees and tearing men apart from a distance. For Montezuma and his council of priests, these reports were not intelligence briefings. They were divine portents. Every detail was meticulously analyzed and compared against the sacred texts and prophecies. The arrival from the east, the pale skin, the beards, it all aligned with the prophesied return of Quetzalcoatl. The sheer technological and biological shock of the Spanish presence short-circuited the Aztec political and military response. Instead of dispatching a full army to annihilate the intruders on the coast, a task that would have been trivially easy for the empire's military machine, Montezuma's reaction was theological. He treated it as a religious problem, not a military one. He dispatched high-ranking emissaries, priests themselves, bearing the regalia of several gods, including the specific vestments of Quetzalcoatl. They carried gifts of almost unimaginable value: 2 massive discs, one of gold representing the sun and one of silver representing the moon, each the size of a cartwheel, along with intricate featherwork, precious stones, and other treasures. This was Montezuma's great gambit, and his most fatal mistake. In his mind, he was making a divine offering, attempting to identify and appease the powerful beings who had arrived on his shores. But to the Spaniards, whose minds were filled with visions of El Dorado, these gifts were not a theological query. They were proof that this empire possessed staggering wealth, and proof that its leader was willing to offer it up. Instead of intimidating the Spaniards, the gifts inflamed their greed beyond all measure. It was a gesture of appeasement that was interpreted as an invitation, a confession of weakness from a king who seemed all too willing to part with his gold. The defining psychological break for Montezuma was not a single event, but a slow, creeping realization that his tools for understanding and controlling the world were failing him. His primary strategy, upon receiving news of the strangers, was one of containment and information gathering, all filtered through a religious lens. He believed he was in a dialogue with gods, or at least their emissaries. His decision to send magnificent gifts was the first part of this strategy. He hoped the offerings would satisfy the visitors, who would then, as gods often did in their myths, depart. When this failed, and Cortés defiantly founded the settlement of Veracruz and began his march inland, Montezuma's anxiety escalated into something approaching panic. His next move was to employ his most powerful non-military weapon: magic. He sent powerful sorcerers and soothsayers to the Spanish camp, tasked with casting spells, weaving illusions, and uttering curses that would confound the intruders and turn them back. According to the chronicles, these magicians returned to Tenochtitlan utterly defeated and demoralized. They reported that their magic had no effect on the Spaniards, that they were somehow immune to the supernatural forces that governed the Aztec world. For Montezuma, this was a terrifying revelation. It suggested that the newcomers were not just powerful, but operated under a different set of cosmic rules. His fatal mistake was his consistent refusal to escalate to a full military response. He did send a force under the Otomi General Patlahuatzin to test the Spaniards in their alliance with Tlaxcala, but the encounter was a disaster. The combination of Tlaxcalan numbers with Spanish cavalry, steel weapons, and cannons proved devastating. The psychological impact of the cavalry, in particular, cannot be overstated. The sight of a man and horse moving as one, a charging metal centaur, was a vision of demonic power that shattered the morale of Aztec warriors. This defeat confirmed to Montezuma that he was not facing men. A human enemy could be defeated by superior numbers. A divine one could not. This was the moment his spirit broke. He came to believe that resistance was not only futile, but sacrilegious. He felt trapped by destiny, convinced that the prophecies were coming true, and that his role was not to fight the end of his age, but to preside over it with as much dignity as he could muster. He chose to wait, to allow the gods to come to his city, where he could observe them, learn their intentions, and perhaps through piety and submission, placate their world-ending wrath. Hernán Cortés was a man of remarkable genius, a blend of ruthless ambition, diplomatic cunning, and an almost supernatural ability to read and exploit the weaknesses of his opponents. As he marched inland from the coast, he was not merely leading an army, he was conducting a master class in psychological and political warfare. His every action was calculated to build a myth around himself and his men. The public demonstrations of cavalry charges and cannon fire were not just military exercises. They were theatrical performances designed to awe and terrify the native populations. He presented himself not as a conqueror, but as an emissary of a great king from across the sea, a benevolent power who had come to right wrongs and punish tyrants. This narrative found fertile ground in the resentful hearts of the Aztec subject peoples. At Chempoala, the capital of the Totonacs, Cortés listened intently to the local chief's complaints about the brutal Aztec tribute collectors. In a brilliant act of political theater, he seized the collectors who arrived and then, in secret, allowed them to escape, telling them to inform Montezuma that he was a friend. He thus positioned himself as both the liberator of the Totonacs and a potential ally to the Aztecs, playing both sides against each other with breathtaking audacity. His greatest coup was the alliance with Tlaxcala. After surviving their initial ferocious attacks, he demonstrated the futility of fighting his forces and then quickly pivoted to diplomacy. He understood their deep, abiding hatred for the Mexica and offered them what they had dreamed of for generations, a chance for vengeance. The Tlaxcalan alliance transformed his expedition. He now commanded a massive indigenous army, with his own Spaniards acting as a force multiplier, a small, invincible corps of shock troops. As he marched toward Tenochtitlan, news of his deeds preceded him. His brutal massacre of the nobility in the city of Cholula, an Aztec loyalist stronghold, was a calculated act of terror. It was a message sent directly to Montezuma. Resistance will be met with utter annihilation. He was using the chaos of the empire's internal divisions, the festering wounds of a century of oppression, as his primary weapon. He did not conquer the Aztec Empire. He skillfully orchestrated its self-destruction, positioning himself as the catalyst for a civil war that was already waiting to happen. Montezuma, watching from his capital, saw only the inexorable approach of a divine force, failing to recognize the brilliant political maneuvering of a mortal man who was turning his own empire against him. The entry of the small Spanish army into the heart of the Aztec Empire on November 8, 1519, was one of the most surreal and momentous events in human history. It was less a military maneuver and more a scene from a fever dream, a procession of the impossible. The Spaniards themselves were dumbstruck by what they saw. As they marched along the great stone causeway over the shimmering waters of Lake Texcoco, they beheld a city that seemed conjured from the pages of a romance novel. Towers, temples, and palaces rose directly from the water, gleaming white in the sun. They saw a metropolis larger and more orderly than any in Europe, a Venice of the New World, teeming with hundreds of thousands of people. The chronicler Bernal Diaz del Castillo, a soldier in Cortés's army, wrote that they were so amazed they wondered if they were dreaming. For the people of Tenochtitlan, the sight was equally miraculous and terrifying. They crowded the rooftops and canoes, their eyes wide with a mixture of awe and apprehension, to witness the arrival of the tools, or gods. They saw the pale, bearded men in their sun-scorched armor, the terrifying great deer that snorted and stamped, and the grim-faced Tlaxcalan warriors who marched with them, their traditional enemies now walking freely into the sacred capital. At the center of this spectacle was the carefully orchestrated welcome by Montezuma himself. The Huey Tlatoani, the secluded demigod, emerged from his palace in a display of ultimate imperial splendor, He was carried in a litter adorned with quetzal feathers and gold under a canopy of green plumage. He descended, and attendants laid cloths upon the ground so that his golden-soled sandals would not touch the profane earth. He approached Cortés and, in a gesture of profound symbolic weight, placed a necklace of golden crabs around the Spaniard's neck. Cortés, in turn, attempted to embrace the emperor, a shocking breach of protocol that was quickly blocked by the attendant nobles. This moment was the climax of Montezuma's strategy of appeasement. By welcoming the Spaniards into the very heart of his power, he believed he was neutralizing them, bringing them into his sphere of control where he could study them and discern their true nature. It was a colossal miscalculation, a triumph of religious hope over political reality. He had not trapped a divine emissary. He had willingly opened the gates of the fortress to the Trojan horse. To comprehend the surrender of Montezuma, we must attempt the impossible, to see the world through his eyes in that moment of supreme crisis. From his perspective, the arrival of Cortés was not the arrival of an enemy army. It was the fulfillment of a prophecy, a cosmic event he had been trained his entire life to anticipate. His actions, which seemed to us like baffling weakness, were, within his own logical framework, a form of profound spiritual strength and piety. He saw himself not as surrendering, but as gracefully accepting the inevitable, as playing his designated role in the grand, cyclical drama of the cosmos. By welcoming Cortés into Tenochtitlan, Montezuma likely believed he was seizing control of the narrative. In the insulated, hyper-controlled world of the Aztec court, proximity to the Huitlatawani was the ultimate source of power and legitimacy. He may have thought that by bringing the strange visitors into his palace, he could domesticate them, awe them with his divine majesty, and ultimately absorb them into his own political structure. It was a classic Aztec strategy: to observe, understand, and then incorporate foreign power. He believed he was engaging in a sophisticated game of psychological and theological chess, a contest of wills with a divine being. This was his moment of hubris. He, the master of a complex and ancient theology, felt he was uniquely qualified to manage this celestial crisis. He would use his vast knowledge of religious ritual and divine protocol to placate these powerful beings, to learn their desires, and to integrate them into his world order. He probably imagined a future where these tools would become a new, powerful tool in his imperial arsenal, their mysterious weapons and beasts used to further solidify the dominance of the Mexica. What he could not conceive of was that the men he was dealing with did not share any part of his worldview. They were not interested in cosmic balance or divine protocol. Their universe was one of sin and salvation, of imperial decree and the pursuit of gold. Montezuma was playing chess, while Cortés was playing poker, and the Spanish captain was holding a gun under the table. Montezuma's welcome was not an act of cowardice. It was an act of supreme and ultimately fatal religious arrogance. The conquest of Mexico was not just a clash of armies. It was a duel between two extraordinary individuals, each the perfect embodiment of his respective civilization. In one corner stood Montezuma, the Huitlatawani, a man of immense but brittle power. He was a product of a rigid, hierarchical, and deeply fatalistic society. His authority was absolute, but rested on a foundation of ritual and prophecy. He was a scholastic, an introvert, a man who believed the world could be controlled by correctly interpreting divine signs and performing the correct ceremonies. His entire life was a testament to the power of tradition and the belief that the future was a reflection of the past. He was a ruler looking backward for answers, consulting ancient codices and terrified soothsayers, while a completely novel threat advanced upon his capital. In the other corner stood Hernán Cortés, a minor nobleman from the impoverished Spanish region of Extremadura. He was everything Montezuma was not: pragmatic, adaptable, opportunistic, and possessed of a boundless, almost sociopathic self-confidence. He was a product of the Renaissance, a man who saw the world not as a divinely scripted play, but as a chaotic arena of ambition, a place to be reshaped by force of will. While Montezuma looked to the heavens, Cortés kept his eyes firmly on the ground, assessing the political landscape, exploiting divisions, and manipulating the beliefs of others for his own gain. He was a master of improvisation, burning his ships to commit his men to the cause, using the myth of Quetzalcoatl against its own believers, and turning the Aztecs' most hated enemies into his most fervent allies. The personal encounter between these two men was a microcosm of the larger civilizational collision. Montezuma greeted Cortés with the solemn gravity of a high priest meeting a god. Cortés responded with the calculated familiarity of a politician seeking an advantage. When Cortés, in a move of unbelievable audacity, placed Montezuma under house arrest within his own palace, it was the ultimate expression of this fundamental difference. Montezuma, bound by his sense of fatalism and a deeply ingrained code of aristocratic etiquette, could not bring himself to order the slaughter of his guests, an act he likely saw as both sacrilegious and dishonorable. Cortés, unbound by any such scruples, saw a strategic opportunity and seized it without a moment's hesitation. It was a battle between a man trapped by his own faith and a man for whom faith was just another weapon in his arsenal. Once inside the palace of Axayacatl, the Spaniards transformed their welcome into a hostage situation of stunning audacity. Cortés, using the pretext of a skirmish on the coast, where some of his men were killed by an Aztec official, made his move. He and a small group of his most trusted captains, their weapons concealed, went to Montezuma's chambers and, through a mixture of veiled threats and feigned respect, persuaded the emperor to relocate to the Spanish quarters. This was the point of no return. The god king of the Mexica was now a prisoner in his own city. From this point on, Montezuma lived in a gilded cage, a bizarre and tragic shadow play of his former rule. The Spaniards allowed him to maintain the outward trappings of his authority. He continued to meet with his nobles, to conduct religious rituals, and to manage the daily affairs of the empire, but always under the watchful eye of a Spanish guard. He became a puppet, his every decree now filtered through and approved by Cortés. It was through the captive Montezuma that the Spaniards began to systematically dismantle the empire from within. They forced him to swear fealty to the King of Spain, a concept the emperor likely did not fully comprehend. They demanded he reveal the location of the imperial treasury, and his palace was soon filled with the sound of Spanish soldiers melting down centuries of exquisite Aztec goldsmithing into crude bullion bars. Montezuma's attempts to maintain control were heartbreaking in their futility. He reportedly played games of totoloque with his captors, engaging in polite conversation, and even offering one of his daughters in marriage to Cortés, perhaps hoping to bind them to him through kinship. He was trying to apply the familiar rules of Aztec diplomacy, alliances, gift-giving, marriage ties, to a situation that was utterly alien. He believed, or forced himself to believe, that he was still in control, that this was a temporary state of affairs, and that the gods would eventually provide a solution. But with each passing day, his authority visibly eroded. His nobles and military commanders grew increasingly restless and contemptuous of their captive king. The gilded cage was becoming a tomb, and the emperor's collaboration, intended to prevent bloodshed and buy time, was instead paving the way for the utter destruction of his world. As Montezuma sat captive, the very foundations of his worldview were crumbling. not just from the outside, but from within his own court. The complex spiritual and political ecosystem that had sustained the empire was proving utterly incapable of responding to the crisis. At the heart of this failure was the Aztec priesthood. These were the men who had educated Montezuma, the astrologers, diviners, and keepers of the sacred calendars, who were supposed to be the navigators of the cosmos. When faced with the reality of the Spaniards, their entire intellectual system collapsed. The omens were contradictory, the prophecies ambiguous. They could not offer their king a coherent strategy because the Spaniards were an anomaly, a variable their religious mathematics had no way to compute. Some likely argued for the Quetzalcoatl theory, counseling appeasement. Others, particularly the priests of the warlike Huitzilopochtli, probably saw the newcomers as a demonic force to be destroyed. This internal division among his spiritual advisors left Montezuma paralyzed, caught between conflicting interpretations, none of which offered a clear path forward. The military and political nobility were equally hamstrung. For generations, they had operated within a system where the Huitlatawani was the undisputed center of power, his word law. Now, their god-king was a prisoner, issuing commands that were clearly coerced by his captors. This created a crisis of legitimacy. To obey Montezuma was to obey the Spaniards. To disobey him was to commit an act of treason and sacrilege against the divine order. His own brother, Cuitlahuac, and his nephew, Cacamatzin, the Lord of Texcoco, urged resistance. Cacamatzin openly defied the Spaniards and was swiftly arrested, betrayed by Montezuma himself under pressure from Cortés. This act, more than any other, signaled to the Aztec elite that their emperor was no longer their own. The failure was systemic. An empire built on rigid hierarchy, absolute obedience to a single divine figure, and a fatalistic worldview had no mechanism for dealing with a black swan event like the Spanish invasion. It lacked the political flexibility and the ideological adaptability to mount an effective resistance. The gods who were supposed to provide all the answers had fallen silent, and the entire ruling class, from the highest priest to the most celebrated jaguar warrior, was left adrift in a sea of terrifying uncertainty. The breaking point, the moment when the tense, surreal standoff in Tenochtitlan finally exploded into open warfare, came not from Cortés, but from his hot-headed and brutal subordinate, Pedro de Alvarado. While Cortés was away from the city, having been forced to march to the coast to confront a rival Spanish force sent to arrest him, he left Alvarado in command. Alvarado was a capable soldier, but lacked any of Cortés's diplomatic finesse or psychological cunning. He was a man of paranoia and violence. During this time, the Aztecs prepared to celebrate the great festival of Toxcatl, one of the most important ceremonies in their ritual calendar, dedicated to the supreme deity Tezcatlipoca. The nobility of Tenochtitlan, the flower of the Aztec warrior class, gathered, unarmed, in the courtyard of the great temple to perform the sacred serpent dance. They were adorned in their finest regalia, gold, feathers, and precious jewels. Alvarado, seeing the gathering of so many influential leaders and warriors, and likely fearing an uprising, made a fateful and catastrophic decision. On his orders, Spanish soldiers sealed the exits to the sacred courtyard and, drawing their steel swords, waded into the crowd of dancing, unarmed nobles. What followed was a methodical, pitiless slaughter. Men, women, and priests were cut down where they stood. The chronicles describe scenes of unimaginable horror, the sacred patio running slick with blood, the air filled with the screams of the dying. The massacre in the great temple was the ultimate act of profanity, a desecration of the most sacred Aztec ritual in their most sacred space. When word of the massacre spread through the city, The simmering resentment of the populace erupted into a furious, unstoppable rage. The fragile spell of Spanish divinity was shattered forever. These were not gods. They were blasphemous murderers. The people of Tenochtitlan, who had watched with growing unease as their emperor was held captive and their treasures were looted, now rose as one. They took up their weapons, obsidian-edged swords, spears, and slings, and laid siege to the palace of Axayacatl, trapping Alvarado and his men inside. The tenuous peace was over. This was now a war of extermination. When Cortés returned to Tenochtitlan after defeating his Spanish rivals, he walked into a city that was a roaring cauldron of hate. The siege was absolute. The bridges on the causeways had been raised, and the palace was under constant assault from a seemingly endless sea of enraged Aztec warriors. In this desperate situation, Cortés turned to his most valuable asset, the captive emperor. He forced Montezuma to make one last, fateful act, to ascend to the rooftop of the palace and speak to his people, to use his divine authority to quell the uprising and order them to lay down their arms. It was a moment of supreme tragedy and pathos. The revered speaker, the demigod, who once could not be looked at, now stood exposed before a furious mob that screamed insults at him. He was no longer a god in their eyes. He was a coward, a traitor, the woman of the Spaniards. He began his speech, his voice likely strained, appealing for calm, explaining that the Spaniards would leave if they were just given safe passage. But his words were drowned out by a roar of fury. The psychological bond between the ruler and his subjects, a bond built on generations of fear and reverence, was irrevocably broken. They had a new leader now, Montezuma's own brother, Cuitlahuac, who was leading the resistance. The mob, which once would have prostrated themselves at the mere sight of their emperor, now unleashed a volley of stones and arrows at the figure on the roof. It was the ultimate act of rejection. The people were not just attacking a man, they were attacking a symbol of their own humiliation, striking out at the leader who they believed had betrayed them to the profane invaders. This was the psychological climax of Montezuma's error. His strategy of appeasement, his attempt to bridge two incompatible worlds through diplomacy and submission, had led to this. He had hoped to save his city from destruction, but in doing so, he had lost the one thing that truly gave him power, the faith of his people. He was now a king with no subjects, a priest with no followers, a man utterly alone, caught between his captors and the righteous fury of the world he had lost. The end of Montezuma is shrouded in the fog of war and competing propaganda, a fittingly ambiguous end for a man trapped between two worlds. According to the Spanish accounts, written to absolve themselves of guilt, Montezuma was struck in the head by one of the stones thrown by his own people. The accounts say he refused all food and medical aid, his spirit broken by the rejection of his subjects, and died from his wounds a few days later. It is a narrative that conveniently places the blame for the emperor's death squarely on the Aztecs themselves. The indigenous accounts, however, tell a darker story. They claim that once Montezuma was no longer useful to the Spaniards as a mouthpiece and had become merely a liability in a desperate siege, he was murdered by his captors. Several sources allege he was stabbed to death with a sword before the Spaniards made their desperate attempt to flee the city. Regardless of the exact cause, the outcome was the same. The great Montezuma, the revered speaker, died an ignominious death, not in a grand temple or on a glorious battlefield, but as a prisoner in his own palace. His death was the ultimate catastrophe, the final symbol of his failed strategy. He had surrendered his authority to save his life and his city, and in the end, he lost both. His body, according to some reports, was handed over to the Aztecs, who, now under the leadership of the war chief Cuitlahuac, cast it aside with contempt. The man who was once a god was now just a corpse, unmourned and unburied by the people he had once ruled. His death marked the final, bloody end of the first phase of the conquest. There would be no more negotiation, no more appeasement. The throne was now occupied by a man committed to total war, and the stage was set for the final, brutal act of the drama. The immediate aftermath of Montezuma's death was one of the most infamous events of the conquest. La Noche Triste, the Night of Sorrows. With their puppet emperor dead and the city baying for their blood, the Spaniards knew their position was untenable. Their only option was a desperate nighttime escape from Tenochtitlan. Laden with as much of Montezuma's looted treasure as they could carry, they attempted to sneak out of the city along the Tlacopan causeway, but they were discovered. The Aztec war drums began to thunder across the lake, a terrifying, heart-pounding rhythm that signaled the attack. Warriors swarmed from all sides, on foot, and in thousands of canoes on the lake. The retreat turned into a frantic, bloody rout. The narrow causeway became a death trap. Spaniards, weighed down by gold, were cut down or stumbled into the water and drowned. Horses slipped on the blood-slicked stones and fell, their screams mixing with those of the dying men. The portable wooden bridge the Spaniards had built to cross the gaps in the causeway became stuck, creating a horrific bottleneck. The gap was eventually filled by the bodies of the dead and the wreckage of their equipment. By the time the sun rose, the scale of the disaster was apparent. Over half of Cortés's Spanish force lay dead, along with thousands of his Tlaxcalan allies. All the cannons, most of the gunpowder, and nearly all the looted gold were lost to the bottom of Lake Texcoco. It was a staggering defeat, a moment when it seemed the Aztec Empire might just survive. Cortés himself, upon reaching the mainland and seeing the pathetic remnants of his once proud army, is said to have wept. This was the Aztecs' last, best chance. They had expelled the invaders, shattered their army, and had a new, determined leader in Cuitlahuac. But the victory was Pyrrhic. It had been won at a terrible cost, and it had transformed the nature of the conflict. Before, Cortés might have been satisfied with making the empire a vassal state. Now, after the humiliation of La Noche Triste, he would be back, not for gold or glory, but for absolute, annihilating revenge. The Night of Sorrows, for all its horror for the Spanish, ultimately sealed the fate of Tenochtitlan, ensuring that the war to come would be one of total destruction. History has not been kind to Montezuma. For centuries, his legacy has been caught in a fierce conflict of interpretations, shaped by the agendas of his conquerors and the needs of his descendants. The dominant narrative, crafted by the Spanish chroniclers like Cortés himself and Bernal Díaz del Castillo, is that of a weak, superstitious, and vacillating ruler. In their telling, he is a tragic but ultimately flawed character, a pagan king paralyzed by omens and prophecies, who meekly surrendered his magnificent empire due to a fatalistic belief that the Spaniards were returning gods. This portrayal served a crucial political purpose for the Spanish. It justified their conquest by framing it not as a brutal military invasion, but as the inevitable collapse of a decadent and irrational regime. It transformed an act of audacious aggression into the fulfillment of a divine plan, with Montezuma as a willing, if tragic, participant. For many Mexicans in the centuries that followed, particularly during the formation of the modern nation-state, Montezuma became a deeply problematic figure, a symbol of national shame. He was contrasted with the heroic resistance of his successors, Cuitlahuac and Cuauhtémoc, who fought the Spaniards to the bitter end. In this nationalist narrative, Montezuma is the archetypal collaborator, the leader who failed his people at the crucial moment. However, more modern and revisionist histories have begun to paint a far more complex and sympathetic portrait. They challenge the Spanish sources, arguing that Montezuma's actions were not born of cowardice, but of a calculated, if ultimately failed, political and religious strategy. They see a ruler trapped in an impossible dilemma, trying to navigate a crisis that was literally beyond his comprehension, using the only tools, diplomacy, religious protocol, appeasement, that his culture possessed. In this view, he is not a coward, but a tragic figure in the classical sense. A great man brought down by a fatal flaw, which in his case wasn't a personal weakness, but the inherent limitations of his entire worldview. He was the product of a deeply religious and insular civilization, a leader whose piety and intellect were uniquely ill-suited to confront an enemy that was ruthlessly pragmatic and utterly profane. So we return to the central paradox, the core question that has haunted this entire saga. Why did the Emperor of Millions submit to 400 men? The final, comprehensive answer is that this was not a simple act of political or military submission. It was the result of a catastrophic reality collapse. Montezuma did not surrender to Hernán Cortés, the man. He surrendered to an idea, to a terrifying possibility that his entire cosmological framework had suddenly validated. His was a crisis of faith on a civilizational scale. Every action he took was rational and logical within his own belief system. When faced with beings who came from the East in a prophesied year, who matched the description of a returning god, and who possessed seemingly supernatural weapons, the most logical response for a priest-king was not to fight, but to appease, to welcome, to understand. He was following a divine protocol for a divine event. The problem was that the event was not divine at all. It was brutally human. Furthermore, the submission was not instantaneous. It was a gradual process of psychological erosion. First came the failure of his gifts to turn the Spaniards away. Then came the failure of his magic. Then came the military defeats when he tested their strength. With each failure, his options narrowed, and the evidence supporting the divine hypothesis grew stronger in his mind. The final blow was his capture. Once a prisoner, he was trapped. An open call for rebellion would have meant his own certain death at the hands of his captors, and would have been a chaotic, leaderless uprising. Instead, he chose to play the long game, to collaborate in the hope of preserving some semblance of order, and perhaps finding an opportunity to outwit his captors. He was trying to manage the apocalypse, to steer the inevitable destruction into the least damaging channels possible. What broke him was not fear of steel or gunpowder, but the terrifying realization that his gods had either abandoned him or sent his destroyers themselves. He was a man whose software was incapable of running the new program that had just been loaded into his world. His submission was not an act of cowardice. It was the logical shutdown of a system that had encountered a fatal error. The life and fall of Montezuma II is more than just a historical account of a conquest. It is a profound and timeless lesson on the fragility of worlds. It teaches us that civilizations, no matter how powerful, wealthy, or sophisticated, can be terrifyingly vulnerable. Their greatest strength, a coherent, unifying worldview, can also be their greatest weakness when confronted with a truly novel and inexplicable threat. The Aztec Empire did not fall simply because Spanish steel was superior to obsidian or because cavalry and cannons were devastating new weapons. It fell because the Aztecs and their leader suffered a catastrophic failure of imagination. They could not conceive of a world beyond their own, a humanity that did not operate under the same cosmic rules. They were defeated by an outside context problem, a challenge so profoundly alien that their political, military, and most importantly, religious systems were unable to process it. Montezuma's story is a chilling reminder of the dangers of insularity and dogma. He was the brilliant leader of a closed system, a man who had perfected the art of managing his known world. But when the unknown world arrived on his shores, all his wisdom, piety, and power were rendered useless. The saga is a verdict on the nature of power itself. Montezuma's power was absolute, but brittle, based on divine right and fear. Cortés's power was fluid and adaptable, based on pragmatism, manipulation, and the exploitation of his enemy's weaknesses. It was a clash between static, ritualized authority and dynamic, opportunistic ambition, and in the collision, the latter proved devastatingly more effective. The universal lesson of his life is a warning against certainty, a testament to the fact that the most elaborate walls we build, whether of stone or of faith, can be toppled in an instant by the arrival of a future we failed to predict. The final frame of this epic saga is not one of battle or of golden treasure. It is an image of silence and ghosts. Travel to the heart of modern Mexico City today, to the bustling, chaotic square known as the Zócalo. Stand beside the vast metropolitan cathedral, a monument to the faith that conquered a continent. And there, right next to it, you will see them. The excavated ruins of the Templo Mayor, the great twin pyramids that once formed the sacred center of Montezuma's universe. The stones are silent now, stripped of their stucco and paint, lying exposed under the modern sun. This is all that remains of Tenochtitlan's beating heart, the place where the emperor once communed with his gods and where the blood of thousands was spilled to keep the sun alive. These stones are the final, powerful metaphor for his story. They lie in the shadow of the new world that was built directly on top of the old, a permanent, ghostly reminder of the God-King who stood at the apex of his civilization, adorned in hummingbird feathers and gold, and greeted his destroyers with a necklace and a welcome. The shadow of Montezuma lingers there, not as a conqueror or a hero, but as a question mark, a testament to the terrible moment when one world ended and another began, a story written in the silent, excavated stones of a buried empire.